Hello, I'm Jack Fink. You're watching Eye on Politics on CBS News, Dallas-Fort Worth. We begin with the economy. The Commerce Department has announced the U.S. economy shrank for the second straight quarter. The gross domestic product slipped 0.9% on an annual basis between April and June. It comes after the GDP dropped by 1.6% between January and March of this year. And now there's a lot of debate in Washington about whether the U.S. is in a recession. President Joe Biden and his administration said the current economic situation does not meet the definition of a recession, but Republicans disagree. We spoke with SMU economics professor Mike Davis to sort this out.
You can call it whatever you like. Call it a banana. I don't care. What we found out today is that the economy continues to slump. That there were a whole bunch of numbers that sort of supported the analysis we saw today. A couple were good, most were bad. So I just think we have to resign ourselves to the fact that we're in for some tough economic times.
What's driving this slowdown?
I think it's a whole bunch of things, which is as the economy always works. All the problems that we're all familiar with, the supply chain shortages, and especially the inflation, especially in food and energy, which are affecting all of us very personally. But you also see the beginning signs that what the Federal Reserve has been doing with interest rates is actually starting to have an impact on the economy. Mortgage rates are way up, and that's just other interest rates are going up, and that's going to slow things down.
What do you think this means for the average Texan? Because, we've seen a booming economy here, not only in North Texas, but statewide. So do you think that there would be a difference, what we're seeing nationally from what we're seeing here in the Lone Star State?
Yeah, probably, but not all that dramatically. Texas has been doing very well relative to the rest of the economy, and we can see that by the fact that a lot of people want to move here. But the fact is that when the hurricane hits, everybody's going to get wet, and Texas will be impacted by this. We may be protected a little bit because we do have a vibrant oil and gas sector, and those prices have been going up. Housing is easier here than it is in most of the rest of the country, but still, we're going to be vulnerable here in Texas.
And I was wondering, when I spoke with the Texas Comptroller, Glenn HEGAR, about this prospect, this potential for a second quarter of a slowdown, a recession, like you said, whatever you want to call it, he said that there is no indication of a recession here in Texas, based on the sales tax revenues that he has seen, which he says have been, over $3 billion for the past 15 months for each month. And when it comes to the fact that so many companies and people are moving here.
Yeah, remember the controller, God bless him, but he's looking in a rearview mirror just like everybody. But he's only seeing a small part of the picture. He's seeing a lot of the tax collections and so forth. This is sales that have happened. Going forward, I'm not so optimistic.
And let me ask you, because I remember in the Great Recession back in 2007, 2008, Texas was last in and first out. Do you suspect that we might see a repeat of that?
We can hope that we'll see a repeat of that, but there's nothing certain, especially in these current conditions. As I'm trying to make comparisons, analogies between previous business downturns, what we're seeing now is nothing like what we saw in 2007, 2008. It wasn't like 2000, 2001. It's most similar to what we saw a long time ago in 1980 and 81. But again, it's crazy what's happening now, and it's hard to just, people should be prepared for anything.
And so let me ask you, when people hear the R word, how much of that is psychological, where even if people, their own economic situation, they've got good jobs, they're not going anywhere, how much of that is, I hear that R word and I need to slow my spending, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that the word recession is kind of like when we get the weather guy comes on and says the temperature is over 100 degrees. I mean, you knew it was hot before you heard that announcement, but when they tell you, hey, it's 100 degrees, you think, man, it is really hot. And that's kind of where we are with this recession news today.
And so what ideas do you have that you think would help the US and perhaps Texas get through a recession?
Well, if you're going to make me king for the day, the first thing I'm going to do is tell everyone to look after your own personal finances very carefully. Make sure that your job is as secure as you can make it. Try and save up some money. That's more important than anything. Policy wise, there's not a lot we can do in the short run, but there's a great deal we can do in the long run. If you think about all the frankly crazy things that impact the productivity of our economy, and we could go on for hours about this, restrictions on what goods we can and can't import, you know, regulations which make it very hard to drill for oil or to build an oil refinery or to transport oil. It's interesting. There is so much potential in this economy. We're doing okay right now, but if we just kind of took the handcuffs off, we could be doing great.
And are you speaking specifically about the Biden administration's energy policies?
I have a lot to criticize with the Biden administration's energy policies, but my thoughts are much more bipartisan than that. We've seen both parties do things for short-term political gain that really hamper the ability of our economy to grow and produce more. And again, if you're going to make me king for a day, I'm not going to attack just the Democrats or the Republicans. I'm just going to pox on all their houses. Please quit playing politics with our economy.
Did you have any specifics in mind where you think, this action, is not helping, this would help?
Okay, here's two things that are neither of which are tremendously important on their own, but it gives you an example of what shows up. We still have all kinds of controls and tariffs, and historically have had on sugar. It's more expensive to buy sugar in the United States than it is in many other places. If we quit catering to a handful of wealthy sugar planters, food prices would come down a little bit. We have something that nobody even pays attention to called the Jones Act. And the Jones Act makes it very, very expensive to ship ocean shipping between ports in the United States. Well, that has a huge impact on energy prices here in the United States, because an awful lot of oil could be put on tankers and gasoline, put on tankers and taken to other ports where it could be very, very useful. But because it's so expensive to put oil and gasoline on ships and ship it within the United States, again, we're shooting ourselves in the foot.
So you think those are two laws or rules that are hurting the economy, and if lifted, we would see a benefit in lower prices?
Oh, absolutely. Now, again, this is long-term stuff. It takes time to, rearrange logistics networks. It takes time to source new suppliers of sugar. But those are just two examples. Again, if you want to make me king for a day, you better make me king for a week, because I got a lot of ideas.
Well, we will have to leave it there. I really appreciate your insight into the economy, Professor. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks for having me.
So one question is, in Texas, which is booming, is there any indication of a recession? This week, I spoke with Texas Comptroller Glenn HEGAR about what he thinks of the state's economy.
There's undoubtedly pockets of the United States that probably have had or in some type of mild recession. However, here in Texas, we're not anticipating a recession. Do we think the growth will drag compared to what we've had in the last year? Absolutely, because we've had a record year. I mean, absolutely off the charts record year in economic growth. But with that, we think the economy is going to continue to grow. as Texas continues to grow, that frees up the ability to invest in roads, to invest in water, invest in public education, to do hopefully a sizable property tax relief next legislative session. So one of the good things, as I sit as the CFO for the state compared to my counterparts in other states, Texas economy continues to grow. People want to move here, and we have economic opportunities, which gives us much more latitude and capabilities in the budgeting cycle than it does in some other states that are unfortunately not seeing the same type of growth we are.
And so just to be clear, you're not seeing any indications of a slowdown in the economy here in the state of Texas.
So we do not see a recession happening here in Texas here in the foreseeable future. But do we see a slowdown compared to the record year we've had? Absolutely, it's going to slow some. However, with that, we think the economy is going to continue to generate jobs. Businesses want to continue to move here. So we think regardless of whether you're in the Metroplex, Houston, San Antonio, Austin, the Valley, Texas is going to continue to grow in the near future and outpace the national economy. We don't have a crystal ball. We don't know exactly what's on the horizon. We know there's going to be a slowdown in the national and the global economy. But with that being said, we firmly believe that Texas will continue to outpace what the average is in the rest of the United States, as well as the rest of the world.
And that's because companies keep relocating to Texas.
Yeah, every morning when we wake up is an astonishing number. And I challenge people to think about this for the next week and in every speech that I give. Every morning when we wake up, we have another 1,000 people roughly that call Texas home every single day, either people moving here or natural growth. And then we also have businesses that are moving here. And we've had a lot more businesses that have moved here actually after the pandemic, because one, for example, they can move their headquarters and they're not necessarily moving every single person anymore. Now with remote capabilities of working, and we've been through that experience. So more businesses do continue to locate to Texas. Texas is a good place to do business. And that's why we think we'll continue to outperform the national and the global economy and economic opportunities.
We spoke with HEGAR about his recent revision of the revenue forecast for the state's budget, and he projected a record surplus and rainy day fund. So what's driving it is huge increases in sales tax revenues.
That's what happened in the last year is truly nothing other than just astonishing in economic growth and revenues into the state treasury. So I updated the revenue estimate from the one we provided last fall, been managing expectations that it's going to grow even more. So now Texas, when we end our 2-year budget cycle, which ends next August, essentially we're going to see that we have about a $27 billion cash carryover balance from the end of this 2-year budget cycle to the next one. That means the legislature has much more flexibility when they come into next session. That's been really driven from a variety of things, both you and I, the consumer, business consumption, economic growth in Texas, sales tax revenues. Unfortunately, a piece of that is because you and I, the consumers, are paying more, whether we go to the grocery store, whether we go to the gas station. And so unfortunately, a part of that increase has been driven by inflation. And especially here in the last several months, really, we see a lot more of our revenues being a result of you and I paying more at the end of the day. And so therefore, unfortunately, a lot of it's inflation driven in the last few months.
Right. Higher prices equals higher sales taxes.
That's right.
So let me ask you just about the breakdown of the numbers you mentioned before. A surplus of nearly $27 billion at the end of next August 2023. And there was an increase. What's driving that was an increase of nearly $14 billion in revenue.
That's correct.
And then
so
also
a combination of two. Yes, one, increase in revenues, also some expenditures that we do not have as of anticipated right now when the legislature set the budget. So that was about $1.5 billion savings. So net total, yes, it's overall up from 12 billion to essentially $27 billion.
And then as far as the rainy day fund, you're projecting that by next August, we're looking at nearly $14 billion.
That is correct. So in addition to the 27 billion, which is our ordinary cash, essentially our ordinary checking account, as you would say, then our state savings account, or also known as economic stabilization fund, or the rainy day fund, as most people call it. And money comes into that fund based on oil and gas severance tax collections. We have higher collections in severance taxes, both because of higher oil prices and natural gas prices than we've ever had in history. So a good month is about $500 million, which is a significant amount of money. In the last 3 months, we've averaged slightly over $1 billion each month, which is more than sometimes we collect in a whole year. So now that fund will have, in essence, about $13.6 billion in it as well.
And these are record numbers, right?
Record numbers. We have literally, let me tell you one statistic to show how massive the last year has been for revenue growth here in the state of Texas, that in the last 30 years, we've had 5 times in Texas history where revenues have grown double digits as compared to the prior year collections. Those have averaged between 10 to 13%. This year, we expect that revenues will increase from last year 24%. So therefore, it is shattering all records that we've ever had. And again, in part, the economy has been extremely strong in Texas, but unfortunately, in the last several months, as we continue to pay more for ordinary purchases, unfortunately, a portion of that is because you and I are paying more at the pump, at the grocery store, and inflation is part of it now.
And I've seen some people try to combine, oh, well, does that mean, Texas has, it's 27 billion plus, 14 billion, 41 billion. Can people do that? You can't combine the two, right?
I've tried really hard to point out that those are two separate issues, and in part the difference between a checking account and a savings account. And so therefore the legislature needs a majority vote to be able to spend money that is the excess. However, one limitation on that, Texas thankfully has what's called a constitutional spending limit. So that means the current 2-year budget plus population inflation growth is a maximum of what the next 2-year budget is. So therefore, there are some constraints. They can't spend all of that excess because thankfully we have to have a balanced budget. We do have spending limits. And then far as the state savings account or rainy day fund, as we commonly call it, that takes a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. There are some limitations on typical ways we have spent that money. We usually save it for a downturn in the economy, that rainy day, as we would say, or for a natural disaster or a one-time expense. It really makes sense that government should invest in this one area right now. So really we try to separate, and I try to keep the two as separate because it's not really proper to lump it as $1 amount.
One thing Governor Abbott had mentioned earlier in the month, and obviously other people have mentioned it as well, Democrats and Republicans, is they'd like to see a large property tax reduction. Do you think that can be possible given the surplus, given the rainy day fund, that a permanent, sizable property tax reduction can be made by the legislature?
Yeah, I think as we've all seen, both appraisal values significantly rise over the course of the last year. And then here in the next coming weeks and coming months, we'll start seeing our tax rates, which will be different, obviously, as local governments set those tax rates of the dollars that they have for property taxes. But I think in essence, the legislature is very focused on trying to do some type of property tax relief next legislative session. That has been a common discussion among the governor, but be among leadership and legislators. So I do think that is going to be a major part of what they accomplish next legislative session.
And the state has the money for that.
Right now, yes, Lee. And the economy, we think, is obviously there's a drag on the economy. The Fed is raising rates. There's a lot of global issues going around that undoubtedly, will we see 24% growth in the next year? No, we will not. That is a one-time record. Texas will continue to grow, but with that growth, I do think the legislature will be able to make a property tax relief effort next session and be able to hopefully keep that in the upcoming years, which is important to you and I, especially as we're paying more every single month because of inflation right now.
Again, this is for the current 2-year budget, which ends August 31st of next year, 2023. He will revise his projections once again in January, right before the start of the regular legislative session. Political headlines now across Texas. The state's new abortion law, the so-called trigger law, formerly known as the Texas Human Life Protection Act, goes into effect August 25th. That marks 30 days after the U.S. Supreme Court issued its final judgment after overturning Roe v. Wade. As we've reported, doctors who perform abortions face felony charges, at least $100,000 in fines, and may lose their professional licenses. Abortion rights providers and advocates have vowed to fight this in court. The U.S. Senate has passed a $280 billion bill that incentivizes companies to build plants that manufacture computer chips. That includes here in Texas. Senator John Cornyn voted for the measure, while Senator Ted Cruz opposed it, saying he disagreed with the bill's direct corporate subsidies. The measure now goes to the House. And now we want to continue to check in with our local government entities. With air travel coming back in a big way this summer, we wanted to find out what's happening at DFW International Airport. CEO Sean Donohue says in some cases, the airport is surpassing levels seen before the pandemic in 2019.
When all is said and done for the summer, my guess is we'll be very close to being about 100% and spot on to what we saw in 2019.
Is that a surprise, given everything that we've been through?
Well, aviation hasn't done a great job of predicting traffic rebounds over the last couple of years. It's obviously been difficult. What I would tell you though is we started planning for this summer last fall and working with all of our business partners, our airlines, our federal partners, our concessionaire partners. We expected the summer was going to be busy. I can't tell you we expected to be at almost 100% recovery, but everyone has put a lot of time and effort into getting ready for this summer.
I know that last week, the Biden administration announced infrastructure grants, and DFW International Airport received some money for that. So where is that money going to go, and how helpful is that to the airport? And it does kind of coincide with the airport's expanded terminals.
Correct, and we're very appreciative of the grant and all the support we received from our congressional leaders on the grant. And it's a $35 million grant to build a new central utility plant. And to your point, the additional central utility plant will enable our future growth at the airport. The other aspect of it, which is exciting for us, is it's going to be a zero carbon central utility plant with some of the new technologies we're using, and it will be an electric powered central utility plant. And since we purchase 100% of our energy we purchase is wind powered, it obviously promotes our position as the largest carbon neutral airport in the world.
And let me just ask you about that point, and then I want to ask more about the terminals as far as carbon neutral. Does this save the airport money in the long term?
Great question. And we take our stewardship in terms of the environment very seriously here, because aviation is a big industry in terms of emissions. So we have a passion for it, Jack, but sometimes what gets lost is the practicality of it and the business benefits of it. And since we have purchased 100% wind power, we've actually reduced our annual electricity costs by $20 million. So, you know, in the whole climate change argument that goes on, and, you know, unfortunately, both ends of the spectrum sometimes get too much attention. We're not a zealot, we're practical, we have a passion for it, but it's good business as well.
And just a question on the wind. You know, there are some days that the wind isn't so great here. And so I'm wondering, do you have enough storage of that, or do you have a guaranteed contract? So even if there isn't great wind that day, you're still getting that wind energy.
Right. Well, 2 points. Number one, when you think of Texas, you obviously think of oil and gas, but to the credit of the state and a lot of other organizations, Texas is actually the #1 producer of wind power in the US, and a lot of people don't know that. Number two, I keep emphasizing we purchase 100% of our power is wind generated. Once that power goes into the grid, whatever comes out to the airport is what comes out to the airport in terms of the power. So our focus is what we can control. We can control 100% of the purchase, but the actual power distribution is whatever comes out of the grid.
Let me ask about that, the new extended and expanded terminals at DFW. They were built, I was actually there for some of the construction, and so they were built in a totally different way. Talk to me a little bit about that. And I know in the future, DFW has mentioned building Terminal F and redoing Terminal C. Is this how things are going to be going here on out?
It is. What we did with what I would call the first phase of reconstructing Terminal C, there are the 5 gates at the very end of Terminal C. We call them the high gates. Jack, to build gates and refurbish gates in the middle of an operation is difficult, it's complex, it's costly. Typically, you can only do the work overnight. What we did with this project, and it's the first one of these type projects in the US at an airport, is because we have so much land at DFW, we prefabricated the construction of these gates at a site on the airport, but it was a site where all the construction workers had the ability to work literally 2 shifts a day, 16 hours a day. They didn't have to be badged. It was a non-secure part of the airport. And then we transported these gates across the airfield. It was a fascinating project. We installed them. From an engineering perspective, I'm not an engineer, but I was amazed. They told us that when they relocated these prefabricated gates, they would clear under the Skylink, our train that goes from terminal to terminal. They said it would clear by 7 inches, and they were spot on. It cleared by 7 inches. And so we reduced
inches. I mean, that's I can't, that's like a ruler. Bring out the ruler.
I know. And I'm not an engineer, so I probably don't give them enough credit, but it was pretty amazing in terms of the engineering sophistication. But the bottom line, we delivered the project about 6 months early, which was very important given this summer. And we also reduced the cost by 25%. So as we look at the remaining reconstruction of Terminal C, that type of modular approach is something that we are very interested in doing. And then as we start looking at the future and a Terminal F, while we have not reached an agreement with the airlines yet on that, we're in discussions with American. We believe that would be the best method as we phase in a Terminal F. And so a lot of work going on, but we are very excited about that model, given the cost savings and the time savings.
And just as far as redoing Terminal C, are you going to be redoing it just with how the rest of it is already there? Or are you looking at, I mean, really, bringing in new parts and adding?
Right. Well, this is the decision we have to make, and we're, again, in discussions with American. When we refurbished terminals A and B and E about 4 or 5 years ago, we basically tore it down to the studs and then rebuilt it within the existing framework. And the terminals are much improved, and we get good feedback from our customers. This time we're interested in, and again, learning from what we did with the prefabricated modular approach, which would allow us to expand the space in Terminal C. And for those who are familiar with Terminal C, and many of our other terminals, with the exception of Terminal D, we have 500 columns in Terminal C. If we look at this new prefabricated approach, we'd go down to less than 50 columns. So as you can imagine, you're walking the terminal and you don't have all those columns. It would open it up and just make it a far superior customer experience.
And my last question on the terminals is, what is the timetable for the airport on redoing C and building F, making that decision?
Multi-year construction project. So we want to finalize the decisions in the next couple of months, hopefully by the end of the year, we'll come to an agreement with the airlines on what is the path forward. But then it will be a multi-year project on both sides.
I also wanted to ask you about other aspects of the customer experience, travelers' experiences at the airport. Let's talk about concessions. And I know that the airport helped the concessionaires when, you know, the pandemic began and the level of travel plummeted. But now travel is back. And what is the airport doing to try to make sure that those, you know, concessions are open when the travelers are there?
Well, to your point, Jack, when the pandemic struck 2 years ago, we lost 95% of our traffic. And our concessionaire business partners, many of them are local businesses, they're small businesses, many cases minority and women-owned businesses. And we knew we had to help them out. So for that first 6 to 9 months after the pandemic, we made the choice, the decision to waive all their rental payments. And we walked away from about $50 million in rental payments that we will never recover, and we're absolutely fine with that because we wanted to make sure they would survive during those difficult times, and they have. And I'm pleased to say, and I give credit to the concessionaires, 95% of the concessionaires have stayed in business. And they are open right now for the summer. There are a few that have decided to shut down. There are others who will remain open, but they're changing concepts. So for our customers, the vast majority of our concessionaires are back open, which is great. Now, I will tell you, just like I believe almost every company in the US, hiring is a struggle. And what we're really focused on with our concessionaires is their hours of operation to make sure that they are open during the peak demands of the day in terms of the customer traffic. And that's what we're working with them and trying to help them out with.
And as far as how does the airport stack up against others across the country when it comes to concessions, given the fact that DFW helped these businesses through the toughest of times?
What we saw was quite a few other airports followed our lead when they saw what we were doing. Some of the other airports made the same decision. And the data we're getting is it varies. Some airports, I'm hearing maybe 70% of their concessions are open. Some airports might be in the 80 to 90% range. But what my team is telling us in terms of the vast majority of our concessionaires being open, we're probably at the highest level of any of the major airports in the US.
And then let's talk about parking. What challenges has the airport faced when it comes to parking, especially when you look at the fact that so few people were traveling for so long and now it's come back?
We made a decision during the pandemic to close some of our remote parking lots because, to your point, there was no traffic. The other decision we made was there's about 60,000 employees that work at DFW, airlines, federal partners, concessionaires, and so forth. During that first year, when the traffic was down, we actually allowed the employees to park in the terminal garages just to make it more convenient for them, easier for them. Well, now that traffic has come back, we've had to move all the employees back to their parking lots. And what has surprised us, Jack, is the customer demand for parking is now actually higher than it was in 2019. And we believe there's two reasons for that. Number one, for several years now, we've had a prepaid online parking product, and it continues to grow where people can get significant discounts if they prepay for their parking. And we now have over 1 million customers in our database who have used prepaid online parking. So that has helped. The other element which has surprised us is the transportation network companies, the Ubers and the Lyfts. Their rates have gone up so much that I believe customers are making the calculations that to park out at the airport for a couple days is actually less expensive than the round trip T&C fee. So we've seen more parking demand because of that as well. So we've opened up our remote lots, our express lots, and but parking has come back dramatically quicker than we thought.
And how long do you expect to continue this incentive where you allow people to prepay and get half off?
Oh, this is a permanent part of our business now, Jack. We want to just provide as much flexibility to customers as we can, as much predictability, and we believe this will just continue to grow.
All right, Sean Donohue, CEO of DFW International Airport. We really appreciate your time and updating us on everything going on out there.
Jack, really appreciate it.
That's it for Eye on Politics this week. I'm Jack Fink. Thank you for joining us. You're watching CBS News, Dallas-Fort Worth.